Hello, everybody. We'll give it just a second as people are coming in, but welcome to the White Too Long Author Salon. I will introduce my friend, colleague, the Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, who's here with us tonight. But thank you all for joining us. We sometimes do these in the middle of the day, like on the lunch break, and we sometimes do them in the evening. So we're glad that you all could join us for our evening session tonight. All right, looks like people are piling in. All right, let me just start off, Adam. I'm going to give you the introduction. So I've known Adam for, I don't know, well over a decade, a dozen years. Really, virtually all the time I've been doing work here in Washington, D.C. God, it may be close to 20, actually, Adam, the one I kind of
Probably
counted
is. Yeah,
back.
not that we're trying to
Scary.
date ourselves, but yeah, that's more accurate.
It's getting close to 20 years. Yeah, since I've known Adam and got to know him better in the kind of more recent years. But I'm gonna give you his formal introduction. It's quite impressive. He has traveled in some pretty heady circles. So the Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, he is president of Sojourners, which most of you know that doesn't need much introduction, an ecumenical Christian organization that works to advance justice and peace. He previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group, served as Vice President of Advocacy at World Vision U.S., was co-founder and executive director of Global Justice, and was selected as a White House Fellow under the Obama administration. He's a graduate of the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. Adam is ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Convention and serves at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. I see some of you are already doing it, but let me invite folks to check in the chat. If you want to just kind of say hello, give a shout out to where you're from, that'd be great. And then if you want to put questions in the Q&A function, we will get to that about halfway through. So Adam and I are going to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then we will open it up for all of you to ask questions. I will just mark, though, that we are sitting at a historic moment right here, right now, as we are recording this. And I'm looking over at my thing. I'm going to share my screen for just one second because I can't quite resist this. Here we go. So we're looking here at Cory Booker, who has just broken the record for the longest filibuster, breaking Strom Thurmond's record in 1957, who was filibustering the 1957 Civil Rights Act. So we'll give it just one little minute here.
I think the best way to honor this great accomplishment to our guests in the gallery, to make a rare exception and let you stand to show your appreciation, I will not constrain my fellow senators. Thank you.
All right.
Well timed.
There we go. All right.
Nice wrapping up.
Yeah. So not irrelevant to what we're talking about today. That we have, for example, when I was tuned in to multiple times today, just checking in on how that was going, I heard multiple John Lewis stories. And oh, by the way, this is Adam's book, A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. If you look at the bottom, foreword by Representative John Lewis, who we heard lots of stories about from Cory Booker today. So Adam, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I just come off a vacation, so I'm grateful for that. And I've been just reflecting on this moment as a real test for the mission of Sojourners, but in a larger sense, in the kind of mission of our faith. So feel humbled by that, but also really resilient about it.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to the book and spend some time on the book, but take a couple of minutes and just tell us what's going on at Sojourners in this, really unprecedented, at least in our lifetimes, moment we're living through.
Yeah, so Sojourners has been, for those that aren't that familiar with us, we are both a publication. We have a digital publication and a magazine called Sojourners, and you can learn more about that at sojo.net. We also are a advocacy organization that tries to equip Christians of all backgrounds and stripes, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical Black church and beyond to put their faith into action for justice. And since I had the honor of becoming president about 4 years ago, I've really tried to grow and strengthen our mobilizing and advocacy arm, complementing our great editorial work. But I feel like this is a moment where we need to strengthen the infrastructure of the faith community to be able to make much more impact and to put our faith into action. So we've been doing that in part by really trying to ensure that faith leaders on the front lines of not only defending our democracy, but strengthening it and transforming it. Did a lot of work in the lead up to the last election to equip and then mobilize faith leaders to engage in voter education. We had nearly 1,000 faith leaders that served as poll chaplains at vulnerable polling sites in 10 battleground states. And then since the election, we really doubled down on that work, both to, advocate for ways of protecting the most vulnerable populations in this current moment. So that certainly for us includes people that are living in or near poverty. That includes the LGBTQ community, and that definitely includes migrants and immigrants. But we've also been trying to shore up the courage of Congress that is really abdicating its constitutional responsibilities in this moment. Starting on Ash Wednesday, we started organizing weekly vigils. We're calling them Faithful Witness Wednesdays, a call for congressional courage, where over 100 plus faith leaders have been gathering to really provide a prophetic witness to Congress to say this is a time to do your job, to protect your constitutional powers, to resist the overreach and abuse of power by the Trump administration. And it's been great to see those really grow in momentum. We're actually building toward our kind of biggest one yet, which we hope will be on April 30th at the Capitol, which will literally be the 100th day of the first 100 days of the Trump administration.
Thanks, Adam. So, I loved, John Lewis writes the, foreword to your book and talks about you getting in the way of injustice as the way he talks about, your work through so many years. And so we can hear that's still going on. So thank you for that work. But let's jump into the book a little bit. So, I always just start off by saying, this is your second book. Is that right? I got that right?
Second book, yeah.
Yep.
Yep,
The
right.
first one was Mobilizing Hope back in 2010. So this is your second book. There's about a decade in between them. So, what was it that thought, okay, I should take the time to, takes a lot of time out from everything else you could be doing. You're obviously doing a lot of organizing work on the ground and have been doing that, to take the time away to say, I need to kind of put some thought into here and bring a book into the world.
It's a great question. And I didn't make the decision lightly to try to write a second book. The first one was a labor of love to get that done. I know you know something about that from a couple times around. But I think after my first book, the first book was really focused on making a case that activism is part and parcel to living out the Christian faith. And in particular, activism that is tied into a commitment to justice. And then, fast forward, about 10 years, and I was at the World Bank leading this faith initiative and doing really meaningful work. But I was watching the buildup to the 2016 election, and I was kind of watching the rise of Donald Trump as a candidate and the MAGA movement start to gain greater strength. And one of the things that alarmed me was that, as we know from exit polls, but even before the election, so many of the ways that then candidate Trump stoked a lot of the worst impulses in our society, particularly those of racism, of misogyny, of xenophobia, weren't deal breakers in that election. And in some ways were motivators for a lot of white Christians in particular. And I really felt like in the lead up to that election, there really wasn't a clear moral vision that could kind of counteract the Make America Great Again vision. And as much as I disagree vehemently with so much of what that vision is kind of saying and what that means, it's kind of an ahistorical vision, it's a dystopian vision, it is still a very powerful one. And I'm someone that's believed in for a long time in the power of not only moral visions, but what a mentor of mine, Marshall Gantz, describes as public narrative, that we understand the world and we understand how we fit into the world through the power of stories, the story of who we are and our own background, but also the story of who we are in community, or the story of us, and then the sense of a story of us, of now, of kind of the urgency of this moment. And so I kind of woke up the morning after the 2016 election, and my then 5-year-old son, Joshua, who is now 14, so this kind of shows you how much time has transpired, but at 5 years old, he comes into my room, and it was a restless sleep, and he was clearly distraught. He was like, "Mommy and Daddy, I really want to know who won the election." And we were kind of processing it ourselves, my wife and I, and we said in response, "Well, we think Mr. Trump won." And his literal response was, "I don't understand how someone who has said and done such mean things could win."
Mhm.
And my spirit just absolutely broke in that moment because I didn't have a way of explaining to him or myself how this had come to pass. And it wasn't because a Republican won, it wasn't because a conservative won. It was because someone who has shown to be so amoral and kind of ran again on this campaign that appealed to so many of our worst vices was able to win. And so he then, responded because he saw how anguished we were. And he was like, "Well, don't worry, it's going to be okay because you're going to make it okay." And I felt kind of the weight of the world on my shoulders in that moment.
Mm.
And that led into a process of me not only trying to discern and better understand how it happened, but more importantly, what is the more unifying, more hopeful moral vision and story that could replace and counteract the Make America Great Again story. And we can talk about the ways in which, that story is appealing because it ties into
Yeah.
so many myths and lies in our history. But anyway, that's what led me to the moral vision that animated the civil rights movement, which is the vision of the beloved community. It's one that Dr. King, but also other civil rights leaders like Ella Baker and so many more constantly referred to. And so I felt like that moral vision is still deeply relevant and very powerful, but needs to be reimagined and recast for our current moment. And so the book really tries to unpack what that would look like.
Well, I appreciate you telling those personal stories about your kids and, and also your own childhood growing up, right, in the book and how that shaped your understanding. And that's something, as you know, I've had to sort of train myself out of academic writing in order to tell those stories of myself about my own, like, so how does growing up a white Southern Baptist in Mississippi affect, like, how does that affect, how I saw everything and, the journey that I've been on. So just so people can like maybe locate you a little bit and kind of the trajectory you've been on, maybe you could tell a little bit about just your own kind of background and some of those perspectives from your own childhood and how that kind of leads up into your own personal story today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, so much of this book was rooted in my own origin story. So, my parents made the controversial decision to get married to each other in 1968, just a year after interracial marriage was legalized through the Loving versus Virginia court case, Supreme Court case, and just a year after Dr. King, or same year that Dr. King was assassinated. And it was controversial because my mother's black, grew up in segregated Louisville, Kentucky. My father was white, grew up in kind of a suburb of Cleveland, and they fell in love in a PhD program at Ohio University. And as they were, trying to kind of figure out whether they can make a life work with each other, they ultimately decided to get married and relocate to Bellingham, Washington, which is where I was in place to grow up. They decided to live there in part because they thought it was one of the few states where they could have a life together where racism wouldn't be the dominant force. And they instilled in me two really deep beliefs that I think helped to shape this book. The first is that my generation, Generation X, I think we're in the same generation, Robbie, it's basically
I'm Gen
inherited the.
Z.
Oh, yeah, of course you are. I didn't want to, out you. Not that
Oh no, I was
I
born in
would, right?
'68, so I was born the
There
same
you
year.
go.
Yeah, your parents got
All right.
married. Yep.
So, that our generation in particular inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. And I took that really seriously,
Mm.
maybe even too seriously at times, to the point where I felt like I was born in the wrong era, that I should have been born,
I was going to ask you about this. I'm glad you
yeah,
brought this up. Yeah.
2 decades earlier, right? So that I could grow up, or I'd be a college student at the height of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's, you know, uh, height of activism. The other thing they instilled in me is that they didn't use this language, but I essentially would say they instilled in me the notion of Imago Dei, that we are all made in the image and likeness of God. So kind of using Genesis 1:6. But their way of saying it was that we all have equal worth and dignity. And they really taught me that my diversity as a biracial Black man was a real source of pride and strength, even though, ironically, it was actually that very issue that many friends and family members try to convince him not to get married because I would be
Mm.
this kind of lost person without a real racial identity, right?
Yeah.
But what it really taught me was that in a broader sense, I really see our nation's growing religious and racial and ethnic diversity as our superpower. And my family are huge Marvel Universe fans. Our dog is named Marvel, actually. And so I really see it as a superpower. But throughout our nation's history, we have had people and forces that have tried to convince us that it is actually our source of kryptonite. And I made a little switch to DC Comics there. But that literally it is, our source of weakness. It's a liability. It's a threat. It's something to be feared. And as probably many of those that are watching this know, that leading up to the 2016 election, the Census Bureau started putting out statistics that showed that within about 40 years, our nation would become a nation in which white Americans would be in the minority and people of color would be in the majority. And, many people responded to that, pending kind of reality with celebration, right? And then others were encouraged to respond with trepidation and fear. And I think that fault line and that kind of tension that has been underneath our politics for a very long time was one of the reasons why there was such a receptive audience to candidate Trump and to his message. And it also helps to explain why I think he was able to win a second term.
Yeah. Well, my argument about this is we've already passed the milestone that matters, right? And that's the white Christian identity majority marker, right? And that actually happened. Guess when? During Barack Obama's presidency, that we
That's right.
changed from being a majority white Christian country to no longer a majority white Christian country, and that led to what I have only half jokingly called the Great White Christian Freakout moment. That I think hands us Trump. That seems pretty clear to me as well. But let's talk about this term, right? So the subtitle is A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community. Now, that's a term people are familiar with. I think they mostly associate it with King, but you actually give a little bit of a broader history of that term. So maybe you could locate it a little more historically, and then how you're bringing it up to date, just so we've got that term in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an organization called the Fellowship for Reconciliation that Dr. King was actually a part of. And it was founded in the early 1900s, and a gentleman named Josiah Royce was really the first one that coined the term beloved community. And that's kind of the first way that Dr. King heard of it. But he also had a mentor named Howard Thurman, who has written incredible books, wrote Jesus and the Disinherited, which is one of the books that Dr. King carried in his briefcase alongside the Bible. And Howard Thurman really kind of further shaped Dr. King's understanding of the beloved community. And so for Dr. King, drawing on Thurman, but also others, the beloved community was about a deep commitment to equality, to nonviolence, not just as a kind of ultimate goal, but as a way of life. He also really embraced this of selfless, unconditional love. And Dr. King, early in his kind of career of activism, so this is, right at the end of his first major campaign with the Montgomery bus boycott, he gave a speech after they got a court victory where he said that the end goal of the civil rights movement is reconciliation. The end goal is redemption. The end goal is the creation of the beloved community. So Dr. King understood that there was something even bigger than civil rights, even bigger than voting rights, which was the end goal, the ultimate vision, or the North Star of the civil rights movement, which he, named the beloved community. And so, drawing on King, but also drawing on Fannie Lou Hamer and Congressman John Lewis and Diane Nash and many other civil rights leaders, I basically try to kind of build on that scaffolding that they created, but then contemporize it for our current moment. And so in my kind of remix and succinct language, to me, the beloved community is building a society, a nation where neither punishment nor privilege is viciously tied to race or ethnicity or to religion or to gender or to sexual orientation. And it's building a country where everyone is equally valued and respected, where our diversity is seen as a strength and not a weakness, like we talked about earlier, and where everyone is able to thrive. And I know that's a big vision, but I think we need a bold and big vision that we can call people to that is actually rooted in our deepestly held civic values and religious values. Part of the brilliance of Dr. King is that he appealed to the ideals of the Constitution. He was actually quite patriotic in that regard. I actually chose this backdrop very intentionally because it's this iconic image from the Civil Rights Movement, and it's draped in the American flag. And sometimes I think the left doesn't embrace patriotism enough, a healthy version of patriotism rather than a nationalistic version of patriotism. There's actually a chapter in the book called Redeeming Patriotism that gets into this. But I think that, we need to be the ones that are the most vigilant and the most vocal about making real the creedal promise of this country of liberty and justice for all. And we need to tie that to many of our commonly shared religious values that I also outline in the book. And so, I kind of build on that definition, but then break it down into what I call the six Beatitudes, borrowing from the Sermon on the Mount, the language of Jesus, the six Beatitudes of the beloved community. And they include a commitment to Imago Dei equality, to radical welcome, to what I call Ubuntu interdependence, to dignity for all, to nonviolence, and to environmental stewardship. And so those become kind of the building blocks that we can really measure that enable us to achieve this kind of bold vision.
Yeah, no, it's really rich. I both appreciate you kind of talking about obstacles, but also the building blocks, right, of kind of putting something together. I want to come back to this thing you said about the unfinished business of the civil rights movement and, this sense of pining away earlier when you're younger and thinking, oh, I've been born in the wrong era. It reminded me of something that I encountered in Doris Kearns Goodwin's biography of Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals, where early on in some of his early letters, he writes something quite similar. Like he thought he had been born after the age of the giants, right? When he looked back at the founders of the country, he was like, oh no, those were the great leaders. And like, I'm born a generation or two too late, to kind of be a part of all of that. And then, right, lo and behold, right, he was a man for his time. And we still, talk about Lincoln, 160 years later, today. And so I thought about that, and I even like wrote it down. Is that you may be getting your wish.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
I
no,
want to ask
I
you
think
about
in a lot of
that,
ways,
whether you've thought
yeah,
about that at all.
right. Yeah.
Like it did seem like there's just been a rift, there's been a break, and when I'm thinking about the crucible in which these terms were really ground out, like in some ways, like when I hear beloved community, if I don't know the history, sometimes I feel like it's a sort of a soft and fluffy, kind of kumbaya thing that's up here in the sky, floats around up here in the sky in some abstract way, right? Instead of being something that's marched into being, like that backdrop, behind you. So I don't know. I just want to ask you to like to reflect. Like, have you thought about that much? That like, oh man, like this thing I've been thinking my life, like I may be like stepping right into it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought a lot about this, particularly in the last year, to be honest. I mean, I've certainly felt it and thought about it before that, but it's really become much more real and acute in this last year. And some of that is kind of feeling increasingly like we're in what could be a Kairos moment. And I don't use that language lightly. I also talk about in the book that I've been heavily influenced by my experience in South Africa. It's kind of my second home in some ways. And I had a chance to study abroad there in 1995, just a year after Nelson Mandela was elected the first Black president of kind of a rainbow nation, South Africa. And through that experience, that's where I discovered this kind of concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are. But I also really kind of found in that experience this really deep sense of my own call. And it's a longer story in terms of how I wrestled with a call to ministry. I resisted it like many other people that have been called to ordain ministry. But I resisted it in part because I felt like calling into ministry meant I was going to be a pastor. And this is no diss to those of you that are listening, they're pastors or that have friends that are pastors. I deeply respect that. But I really didn't feel called to that. And it took me a long journey, an argument with God to realize that my distinctive calling was to revitalize, to rekindle a commitment to justice as an animating force within the church. And not just the Black church, but kind of the church broadly. And this felt pretty heavy when I finally kind of realized that this was my distinct calling. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to live out that calling in an organization like Sojourners, which literally has a mission to try to inspire and equip churches and Christians of all stripes to put their faith into action for justice. And so the thing that kind of crystallized for me on Kairos is that Kairos, is God's understanding of time and these moments where things can become so fraudulent and so pernicious around us that it can force an awakening that can lead to a reckoning. And I think we're in one of those times. I actually thought we were in one of those times over 4 years ago when I wrote this book. And I admitted in a kind of new prologue that I wrote for our own online publication that I definitely underestimated just how much Christian nationalism had seeped into the very bones of the church. I underestimated how much the big lie had metastasized into our body politic, that the last election was stolen, this 2016 election was stolen. And so, as I wrote this book, I was kind of thinking that the MAGA movement was receding in 2020, and then it created an opportunity for a kind of fourth founding of our country. We had our first founding, and then the second founding with the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, third founding with the civil rights victories of the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. And then we actually now had a chance for a real fourth founding. And I still think that that need is there, but I think we had to do a lot more groundwork in order to enable that to happen. And some of that is some of the setbacks we have seen with not only the re-election of Trump, but the degree to which there is a very large number of Americans, particularly white Christian Americans and evangelical Christians in particular, that literally have embraced a strong man and the desire for a strong man so that they can have their particular brand of Christianity that I think is more of an ideology than it is a consistent theology in power. And they are therefore playing on a very different playing field than the rest of us who are still believing in liberal constitutional democracy. And so I'm just saying that because I'm trying to paint a little bit of a picture of how stark the terms are right now. And yet I still remain hopeful. And I know that this is a moment that's going to require a lot of sacrifice and a lot of courage for those of us that still believe in not only the ideals that, can make this country, one that we want to be proud of, but it also is directly tied into our most deeply held religious convictions.
Yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate you being very clear. You have a whole chapter on, unmasking America's myths. And just so we get this out very clearly here, the whole reason why we have even a conversation among historians and kind of social critics about there needing to be a second founding, a third founding, now maybe a fourth founding of the country is because there's like one fundamental thing that has always been in the way, and that is, you want to say it or you want me to say it?
White supremacy.
White supremacy. Yes. I just so thankful that you're just so clear about that, right, in the book. This is the thing that we are still tripping over. This is the thing that is still in the way. This is the thing that people are still clinging onto. And my book White Too Long, I just remember that piercing indictment from James Baldwin, where the title of the book comes from him, where he says, I've been great, and this is after King's assassination. He says, I've been so impressed by the great majority of white Americans and have been impressed for some time that they are beyond an inconceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They've been married to the lie of white supremacy too long, right? And this is what we're still, it's pretty straightforward, what we're still struggling with. So I want to just two more things I want to cover here, and then we're going to open it up. So We got a couple of things in the Q&A. Let me go invite you to load up a couple of more as we're kind of winding toward that part of the conversation. So I'm going to ask you a pointed question, Adam. Do you love America?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love America. In particular, I love the ideals of America, the ideal of equal justice under the law, the ideal of liberty and justice for all. And I know that those have been severely compromised throughout our history. So that's where, I mean, it's interesting because I chose the title very intentionally and carefully because, more perfect union, which is lifted out of our preamble, the emphasis for me is always on the more. It's not on the perfect. Otherwise, we get caught into this trap of perfectionism or even triumphalism. But when you put the emphasis on the more, it's the constant striving of trying to become that ideal. And that is the best and the brilliance of the American project versus opining for something that never really was. I mean, that's what Make America Great Again does. It's constantly looking backward. America certainly wasn't great in the 1950s if you were black or if you were brown, let alone if you were a woman, right? Instead of looking forward to say, yes, we have been an imperfect project from the beginning, but we are constantly striving to become that more perfect union that lives more fully into our credo promise. And so that's kind of where the love comes from. And also quoting James Baldwin, he said that the greatest love for your country is being willing to critique it and force your nation to live up to its ideals. And that's the kind of patriotism, again, that I think we need to be embracing on all sides.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot with the
Sure, no, that's right.
the patriotism question. I mean, it is a commentary, right, on our that it feels like a gotcha question, right? That our cultural moment is such that if you ask anybody who is it MAGA if they love their country, it's like, oh, it's an entrapment question or something, when it should be, yeah, of course. It's just a matter how we love our country, right? And what we're hoping for our country. So last question here. I want to ask you, do you have a copy of your book with you in front of
I
you?
do, yeah. Yep. So the
I was
paperback
gonna
came out last week. And
oh,
yeah, that's
paperback. Yep.
yeah.
I was going to ask if you'd be willing to read a piece.
Sure.
I got a quick question for you, and then if you could close by reading a piece.
Yeah.
It's actually that short letter to your kids at the end,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
page 228, 229, I think, somewhere
Yep.
around in there.
Sure.
But before we get that, I do want to ask you just the question probably a lot of people have on their mind. So you wrote this in 2021. You're working on the manuscript, kind of leading up to that. But when it comes out, we're in some ways at the kind of peak intensity of the Black Lives Matter movement. We're moving out of the first Trump term and into the first Biden term. We are obviously in a very different place today. And actually, we're in a very different place than we were on January 19th, even in this country, right? And we're recording this on April 1st. So it's not that long, and so much has already changed. You at the end of the book, you clearly say, like, look, despite everything, I still believe this is possible, right? You'll still believe this was within reach. And is that still true? You still think that?
I still think that. I do. And I am absolutely crestfallen that we have made so many steps backward and we are in a dangerous, in some ways, unprecedented moment with what I would argue is the most, likely kind of authoritarian president that we have had in our history. And I don't say those words lightly. And so, yes, I mean, I think in some ways that is enabling and maybe forcing some people to wake up. I'm also heartbroken that so many people are being hurt in the process, as we, turn the page, if you will. But I do think this is a moment where not only do we need to be paying attention to what's happening, we need to get into the fight. We have to get into the struggle. And that's not going to look the same for everyone. I believe we all have different gifts and in some ways slightly different callings. But I do think this is a moment where we all have to find our role in the backdrop behind me, the modern day version of that. So, yeah, I mean, I still believe, I think in some ways, like, there are many setbacks during the civil rights struggle. And it was hard when you were sitting in, the late 1950s or early 1960s to imagine that within 5 years, 10 years, there would be major victories like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so while it can feel overwhelming and demoralizing in this moment, I really still believe that we can turn things around, and that sometimes when you're faced with such, kind of raw injustice and cruelty and incompetence, that is the springboard for the kind of transformation that our country ultimately needs.
Great. Well, that seems like a good segue. So I was so moved by this. So Adam includes a letter to his kids at the end of the book. It reminded me actually of Baldwin's letter to his nephew, right? At the front of the fire next time. You may have, I don't know if you had that in your mind when you were writing this, but it struck that parallel with me. But anyway, I'll leave it to you to take us to the Q&A with that. But
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'll just set the scene for this a little bit. So I mentioned that I was born in Bellingham, Washington, and I moved when I was 16 to Tucson, but still kind of see Bellingham as one of my homes. And we had a cabin that was basically kind of right over the beach. And there's this big rock that I would constantly spend a lot of my time on during the summers. And it later became my thinking rock, my praying rock, and still is in a lot of ways. And so I literally was sitting there, not knowing what the election outcome was going to be in the 2020 election. We wanted to write a letter to my sons that would kind of give them the answer that I wasn't able to fully articulate when my son asked me that question in 2016 in terms of what happened. So this is what I write. Sons, this country has been terribly divided since even before the Constitution was agreed upon and our nation was born. It was bitterly divided over the evil of slavery, the annihilation of the native population, the subjugation of women, and so much more. Division has been a defining feature of our politics, but so have struggle and hope. What all of us 200 plus years later can agree on and still should embrace are the ideals that America was built on. Those ideals of equality, dignity, freedom, and inalienable rights are precious and worth fighting for. They are also based on and resonate with the very ideals and values of our faith. But these ideals are not a given. They do not come easily or without a price. They must be continually fought for and expanded to include all people. We the people, in these yet to be fully united United States of America includes you, it includes me, your brother, mother, and everyone who is in this incredible country. And despite all of its flaws and wounds, we continue to believe in these ideals and that they can regularly be reborn and more fully realized. Our faith says that Christ can make all things new, and that applies to this nation as well. Our faith enlists us to be part of the vision and work of making all things new, of building the beloved community, and forming a more perfect union.
It's beautiful. Thanks, Adam.
You're welcome.
All right, so we got one question. There's one for me to fix the screen, which I'm not sure what to do about that one, but the other one we'll jump into. It's from Teresa. Is it conceivable to look at this moment in our history as the Fuller's fire, the refiner's fire? My context that the U.S. has never fulfilled its origin myth of a multiracial democracy. Could this full-on attack on our democracy be calling us to finally fulfill that?
Great question. I think it does. I mean, I think our history has been a tug of war between, the ideals and the promises that the founders put into the Constitution and the crippling contradiction that was also built in the Constitution that slavery was legal, that Black Americans weren't treated as a full human being, and that only white landowning men could vote. And so we've had this struggle to expand the suffrage over the course of our history, first adding women and then adding all people of every racial background through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I do think this is kind of a refining moment, and sometimes the fire refines us. It kind of calls out our best self and our greatest courage. And that's what I think we most need in this moment. And I guess, one thing that I want to emphasize is that, on the one hand, this period is going to be, and already has been, really ugly, and it's going to be filled with a lot of suffering, unnecessary suffering, and a lot of unnecessary hardship. But I actually think that the journey of co-creating the beloved community, while it is a struggle, it also is one that can be filled with joy. It can be filled with deeper connection and solidarity with one another. And that by engaging in it, we actually can affirm our full humanity. So I don't want to just focus on the negative as much as I want to be real about the struggles that we're in and what we're facing. But I think that there's something beautiful that comes out of the process of engaging in building the movements that can ultimately transform our politics.
Yeah, I've been thinking, one of my things I keep coming back to, particularly thinking about predominantly white Christian spaces, boy, and how anemic we have been, both during those decades we're talking about, the 50s, the 60s, the civil rights era. And, something I've said is, the unlike, I think, the African American churches, which in some ways, I mean, certainly have issues and have their own struggles, but um, they were not built to be places to be complacent and comfortable. They were built as places of kind of building strength, in many ways resistance. And those lines from King in Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he talks about, with this arresting image of, he's talking about predominantly white churches, sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows. I think about that a lot, and just that I think that's something that predominantly white churches and Christian spaces are going to have to get used to, being uncomfortable and being, not coming to church, to be comforted and escape from, but to come and like get strengthened to go out, right, and fight for the country we want to see, and that's something quite different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's also a reason why during the heart of the civil rights movement, most of the major marches that led to arrests and time in prison were preceded by worship services inside of churches. I mean, they gathered in churches for a reason, and were filled with the Holy Spirit and sang freedom songs, but also sang gospel songs as a way to strengthen their courage and to, experience that spiritual vigilance and sustenance they needed to then go out into the streets. And so I do think that there's arguably a need for some of that revival within our own movements for change that is really important for today too.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I'll tag on to that is, it may be that, churches rediscover themselves by doing that work, right? And
right.
that, actually, we're not just, a country club or, a social club or a book club. We're actually about like standing up for, the vulnerable. We're actually about standing up for justice, and we're about putting ourselves at risk to do that. That's something quite, that would be a new thought, right, for many churches in the country.
Yeah, no, and would rehabilitate the reputation of the church itself, which has been really bruised and battered. I mean, I make this argument particularly to other evangelical Christians. Like, we both care about the Great Commission. Like, I take that seriously. I don't believe in proselytizing, but I believe in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And so one of the most effective ways, powerful ways that we could share the love of Jesus is by being deeply committed to protecting the most vulnerable in our midst, to be deeply committed to standing for justice. And I actually think that would be something that would surprise some folks. It's kind of part of the reason why Bishop Buddy's amazing sermon on mercy was really about unity, but she, made a plea for mercy at the end of it, struck such a chord, including among a lot of spiritually but not religious folks that, probably have left the church because they felt excluded or been harmed, but they heard the gospel in a public setting and it really broke through. And so again, I just think there's an opportunity for, evangelism, if you will, in the context of pursuing justice.
All right, we got a couple more questions. This is from Janet. It seems to me that persuadable white Christians is too small a group to make a difference. What do you make? And I'll tag on to that. Yeah, and we're also in a more secular age than we were during the civil rights movement, right? We've all seen the attendance numbers and the religious affiliation numbers and the unaffiliated numbers, right? It's now 27% of the country claims no religious affiliation. And among the young people that are in that banner behind your head there, it's 40% who claim no religious affiliation. So those two things kind of go together to me. So I don't know. What do you make of that? You write about this a little bit.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I deeply believe we have to build a big tent movement that's committed to multiracial democracy, inclusive multiracial democracy. And that tent is going to need to include a lot of folks that are spiritual but not religious, a lot of folks that are Muslim and Jewish and of other faith traditions, and still a lot of folks that identify as Christian. I think I'm kind of a person that believes every heart can be changed, even the most hardened ones. So I don't kind of give up on anyone. But I am particularly frustrated, I would even say exasperated, with the degree to which a big swath of the white evangelical movement has become so kind of hijacked and politicized in a Christian nationalist way
Yeah.
that there's not a lot of persuadable people, at least in a immediate sense. And so I personally think that a lot more energy needs to be put into reaching a lot of that younger population that is spiritually but not religious, to mainline Protestants. And, Robbie and I, we've talked about this and shared
Yeah.
some of our own angst about this, but so much attention gets put on white evangelicals. And I understand some of the reasons for that, but it can easily gloss over the reality that over half of white mainline Protestants and white Catholics have been voting consistently for President Trump. And lots of different reasons why, but they are being swayed by a lot of these same forces within their church, including, false theologies like Christian nationalism. And so I really see that as a crisis of discipleship, that there is such a gap between kind of what is advocated on and what is professed by national denominations and what is happening within the pew or within local congregations themselves. And there's no magic bullet to close that gap. But I think that part of the solution is really equipping pastors on how to better preach and teach in a way that shows a commitment to justice, but can do that in a way that doesn't come across as overly partisan or overly divisive, and to really build more resilience within congregations, particularly kind of purple ones, or very diverse ones, where the solution can't be that we just become apolitical, because following Jesus has profound social, economic, and political implications. And I really love lifting up a quote by Dr. King, where he said, "The church at its best is called not to be the master or the servant of the state, but to be the conscience of the state." And so we know when you try to become the master, you often get co-opted and then you become a servant. And I think that's what happened with the religious right movement. But we've got to be that conscience. And that means that we've got to, in the words of John Lewis, really get into good trouble as a part of living out our faith.
Yeah. Yeah. And, there's just such a clear, we can actually measure this in surveys that this is exactly what we see. The kind of politicization of the Christian right movement in the 70s and 80s. And let's just be clear that begins, and you write about this in the book, and I'm really happy to see you make this point, not with abortion, not with kind of LGBTQ stuff, but with the civil rights movement, right? It's a reaction to the civil rights movement. So the politicization of white conservative churches that resulted in the Christian right movement then gets kind of morphed and becomes at least intermingled with the Tea Party movement. And then those things get both folded into the MAGA movement, right? And that's just such as clear. And so if there were ever a clearer trajectory of something getting completely co-opted, right? And now it's a servant, to Trump, and has lost any semblance of conscience or being willing to call virtually anything, out. So wholly lost. I think that's right. And just so folks have the numbers, Adam and I talk about this a lot. I should say, Adam, this is like really fun to get to talk to you about substantive stuff. We're often like at meetings or in hallways and grabbing a quick coffee in between stuff. So it's great to actually get to talk about your book here with folks. But but the numbers, right, are pretty clear that, yeah, the white, if you're only talking about the white evangelical movement, I mean, they are only 13% of the US population, and they voted 85% for Trump and have voted around 8 and 10 at least every time Trump has been on the ballot. So not a lot of persuadable people there. The people who were there, basically who are not in the MAGA movement, have either left that category or are still in that 15%. They're just holding on. They're in a very minority. The groups that are more 60-40, more purple, are actually the non-evangelical Protestants, sometimes called the mainline, white Catholics, even Latino Protestants are more like 60-40. All of those groups actually lean toward Trump, but they're 60-40, not 85-15. And I think that's where a lot more work, really needs to be done. We got a couple other things here. So from Kurt, it's interesting. It says, I'm white and my church is mostly Asian American immigrants. Sometimes I wonder if they can understand the burden I feel of white complicity and racial wrong, especially toward blacks. Any comments?
One, I just appreciate, Kurt, you acknowledging some of that complicity and really wanting to find a way to kind of repent. And what I mean by repent is kind of acknowledging wrongdoing, but then being committed to helping to turn us into a different direction, right? That's the action side of repentance. And so I think part of that process is being willing to be on the front lines of some of the fights for racial justice today. And, some of that is definitely tied into defending the freedom to vote, which is increasingly under attack. I don't know if everyone watching really paid attention to the executive order that President Trump signed last week. Kind of got lost in the controversy around the use of Signal and that whole kerfuffle. But he signed an executive order that is essentially arguing that he has the power to force states to make mandatory voter IDs that a lot of voters, particularly or disproportionately Black and brown voters, don't have. And this is all under the false pretense of addressing a problem that's not really a problem, which is a voter fraud among illegal or undocumented immigrants. It is almost non-existent, and yet there's efforts to try to impose new restrictions to solve a problem that actually doesn't exist, all to make it harder for those communities to vote. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is to basically prevent any state from counting a mail-in ballot that comes in after Election Day. And we know in many states, they have laws in place that work very well, that as long as a vote or a ballot is postmarked by Election Day, if it comes in for whatever set of reason, oftentimes the default of the mail system, a couple days late, it can still be counted. And so he is still, kind of angry about the 2020 election and is, already trying to make steps that would muck up our election system and make it more challenging for certain voters to vote. So just raising that as one example where, to me, the ability to vote, the freedom to vote is kind of the lifeblood of our democracy. It's what lends our democracy its credibility. And if that gets undermined, and I'm confident there'll be more efforts like this to undermine it, then we're really facing even tougher waters going into 2026 and then, of course, 2028. The other one that I would just lift up is this kind of fixation by President Trump and the GOP more broadly on kind of attacking and essentially dismantling commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And DEI has become this kind of new straw man, this new boogeyman in our politics. And it's complicated because DEI means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I really believe that a core commitment to fairness in the workplace and beyond, and a core commitment to justice is really what DEI is after when it's done well. And this is a time where we really have to redouble our commitment to those kind of programs, whether it's in our own organizations, like my own of Sojourners, but also within our federal government and within the corporate sector. And we're seeing this incredible backtrack because of the rhetoric of the current administration and pressure they're putting on companies and universities and more. And so, this kind of whole argument that they just want to have a merit-based society is ludicrous when we look at the kind of folks that were confirmed into key positions. The Secretary of Defense is being case number one of someone who's completely unqualified and yet got the position because he's absolutely loyal to Donald Trump. So anyway, I can name a lot more things. I'm deeply worried about policing and kind of what's going to happen with our policing system and kind of backtracking when it comes to ending police brutality and racialized policing. But those are the kind of things that we really need a lot more champions of all racial backgrounds, but I think in particular, white men are really needed to be in some ways the most vocal.
Yeah. All right, we're going to have one more question. We're almost at time, but I'll take one from Thomas, who says, for 18 months, I campaigned for office as a Democrat in Arkansas for state representative. First of all, thank you for stepping up, in whatever party, but for stepping up for public service. So thank you for doing that. Visiting 57 evangelical churches. 90% of these churches were squarely supportive of Trump, and Republicans, nearly every message was a political rally for Trump. What is the way forward to turn the church back to being a true "what would Jesus do" church, a Jesus church? What's the way from the cultural Christianity today to a New Testament church? That's a good one to end on, I think.
That's a great one. And I generally wish I had the full answer. I think we're all kind of grappling and struggling with what to do in, converting those churches back to the gospel, to be honest. Um, I think there are going to be opportunities, particularly in the days to come, where some of the cruelty of this administration is just going to be so stark and egregious that there are going to be many evangelical Christians that increasingly have heartburn and soul burn around what's happening. I think you saw this happen to some extent when in the first term, the administration put in place the family separation policy that caused, rightly so, a huge public backlash. And, I saw particularly a lot of evangelical women just feel like that was a bridge too far and started to, some started to speak out, some, really started to have real kind of spiritual and existential angst around that. I'm actually seeing that to some degree, although it's a little bit more quiet at this stage around the administration's effort to essentially end and dismantle our foreign aid system, which includes programs like PEPFAR, which literally has helped to save and prolong the life of over 20 million people across Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. And when you start to call programs that feed hungry people and keep people alive evil, like Elon Musk did, we're literally in a kind of Isaiah moment who, that prophet literally said, "Woe to you who call evil good and good evil, that call lightness dark and darkness light." And so I think we have to really, for those of us that are people of faith, use the language of our faith and appeal to scripture and to our faith to challenge some of these just heretical things that are happening. And ultimately, we're called to love our enemies. And so I think we have to show a kind of tough love toward Christians that are being kind of led astray and are drinking the Kool-Aid of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I won't say much because I'm going to give you the last word, but I just want to echo that last point that, I think one of the biggest challenges is that there is this kind of sense of propriety and politeness running through, that we've got running through kind of white Christian spaces in particular. But I think we're going to have to get over that. I mean, I think we're going to have to call out our brothers and sisters when they're harming people, when they're clearly supporting evil. Like this is not something we could stand idly by and just chalk it up to political differences. These are much more than political differences. I mean, there are literally lives at stake. The democracy is at stake. And I think we're finding ourselves, kind of takes back to the beginning, Adam. I think we're all getting your wish, that we're going to be in these times that's a hinge point in history. And we're going to live. And when I know we've heard people say this, but I think it's really true. When we all wonder what we would have done, in the 1930s in Germany, or what we would have done in the 1950s and 60s in Alabama or Mississippi, we're about to find out, because it's what we're doing right now. So I'm really hoping, your book is going to help us, I think, see more clearly stiffen our spines and give us some hope. But let me just give you the last word here, Adam. Like, you've been in a pulpit before, so maybe take us home here.
I'll take us home by actually citing a scripture, and I certainly recognize there might be people of different faith persuasions listening to this, but just one scripture that's been really near and dear to my heart in this moment has been Galatians 6:9 that says, "Let us not grow weary in doing good, because in due season we will reap a good harvest if we do not give up." And I really think that part of the strategy of authoritarian governments is to overwhelm us with shock and awe. I mean, that is certainly what we've seen in these first 100 days, and we're not even through them yet. We still have another month before the first 100 days expires. But I think just as fear and despair and feeling overwhelmed can be contagious, bravery and courage can also be equally contagious. And so the more we show that, the more we break through this kind of collective action problem that has, I think, riddled the church in particular for a long time. But it also enables us to feel strength in the movements that we're able to build. And, one of my favorite kind of quotes about movements is that movements have the power to make the impossible become inevitable. Like when you're in the middle of a movement, it can feel impossible that the MAGA movement can be defeated and be replaced by the beloved community. But of course, when we look back in history, it almost felt like it was inevitable that the civil rights movement happened and these victories happened. But of course, it took courage and sacrifice to become contagious. So let's make it contagious.
Yeah, no, it's in our hands. All right. Well, thank you all. Adam Taylor, his book is A More Perfect Union, A New Vision for Building the Beloved Community, with a foreword by the late Representative John Lewis, who we've been hearing a lot about today from Cory Booker. Also sort of historic moment today. But Adam, thank you so much. Thanks for everything you're doing. Thanks for the book. And we'll see you soon.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Robbie.